This is a moment of trauma and opportunity in the United States. With a history of racist lynchings and daily racist assaults, my Black and brown brothers and sisters identify in the most intimate of ways with George Floyd's life and his last breaths. His murder and suffering are in many ways theirs, and in different ways, those for the rest of those of the United States as well. Many of my African-American friends and colleagues are experiencing trauma and anxiety with impacts on their body. As someone who was once nearly killed by the police with what later became known as the Eric Garner chokehold, with my PSPD, I also share that trauma. This is a critical period of resistance to governmentally sanctioned and international and institutional racism, of resistance to organized police brutality, mounting fascism, and the growing danger of armed conflict here in the US. In the tradition of crisis being a moment of danger and opportunity, the good news is that people across the country are coming out of their homes amidst the viral plague to insist that Black lives and democracy matter. As you have seen, with the courageous protest and people's willingness to risk illness and death from COVID-19, and from the violence of police and National Guard, hundreds of thousands of people have transformed this into an opening for movement and for profound social and political change. And as we see in the divisions that increasingly divide the ruling elite, we may prevail. Friends, we face four simultaneous interrelated crises that have exploded into our uprisings. First came the failed response to COVID-19 that has taken more than 100,000 lives here. Due to institutional racism and violence, this virus has disproportionately taken African-American lives and those of other people of color. Then came the economic fallout from the coronavirus, which has left nearly 40 million workers unemployed, with them and their families increasingly desperate, facing hunger, homelessness, loss of medical insurance, and more. Again, African Americans and other people of color have been disproportionately impacted. Third is the wave of police violence against African Americans, the increasing numbers of African Americans killed in 21st century lynchings by the police and other right-wing racists. Most recently, those of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and just this week, Emmanuel Ellis. Fourth is the racist, lawless, and brutal president and his enablers, who have no respect for human life, democracy, and its institutions. Donald Trump's father was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and the apple has not fallen far from the tree. Explicit encouragement of racism was central to his rise to power. And his political base began to be consolidated years ago with Nixon's Southern strategy and by Ronald Reagan, who launched his presidential election campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, a place best known for the murders of 3 civil rights workers. Trump and his cronies have encouraged Nazi and police violence, dispatched armed thugs to threaten responsible elected officials, launched the police to terrorize and arrest peaceful demonstrators. And Trump and his racist and plutocratic cronies are doing all they can to prevent free and fair elections in November, with a focus again on disenfranchising people of color. That's enough from me. The purpose of our webinar is to help friends and allies gain a better understanding of what is happening here in the US and why. With us are great people, friends, and colleagues who will share from their lived experiences and analyses, as well as what they and others across this country are doing to force an end to police brutality, to racism, and the assaults on democracy. I'll briefly introduce our agenda and speakers. We'll begin with Reverend Karlene Griffiths Sekou, an active figure in the movement for Black Lives. She is an international public health professional, a speaker, preacher, cultural worker, and community organizer. She is the founder of the Dignity Project, and her work has been situated within the realms of international human rights and decolonial and anti-colonial cultural regeneration. She is currently a PhD candidate in the Committee on the Study of Religion at Harvard University. Karlene will be followed by Webb, the director of the American Friends Service Committee's Healing Justice Program in New York City. After graduating from law school, Lewis dedicated his career to criminal justice issues. Before joining the AFSC, he worked with the District Attorney's Office in Brooklyn and with the New York City Department of Corrections. He has taught criminal justice, jurisprudence, and criminal law at various colleges and universities. At AFSC, Lewis focuses on decreasing New York's prison population. He is widely recognized as an expert on the school-to-prison pipeline, barriers to successful reentry, and energizing communities of faith and cultivating young activists. Lewis will be followed by Jim Anderson, who is a longtime civil rights and peace activist. Jim is vice president of Peace Action New York State, vice president of Citizen Action of New York, a member of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament and Common Security's board, and chair of the Health and Wellness Committee of 100 Black Men of Greater Buffalo, New York. After Jim speaks, we'll have time for a question and answer session, and then Philip Jennings, the International Peace Bureau's new co-president, will then close the webinar. Philip long served as the General Secretary of UNI Global Action, the global trade union with 900 unions in 150 countries. His dedication and ingenuity led to a transformation of global union work from supply chain justice, and notably the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety. And he took that through global agreements with multinationals to union solidarity. Philip was instrumental in ensuring that the labor movement finally achieved a seat at the G20 and sits on the board of the UN Global Compact in New York. I think that gets us started. Karlene, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brother Joe, and thank you for the invitation. I really wanted to situate my talk within sort of the longer trajectory. In answer to the question that you posed, how did we get here? And it would seem that it would be repetitive and that this is self-explanatory, but too often, even today in the current uprising, people are still baffled as to why protesters are in the street, and more importantly, why rioting seems to be happening. And the truth is that, you know, it's comfortable to use phrases like peaceful protest in this moment, but what has not been talked about as much is the everyday quotidian violences that people have to endure just by existing in the white supremacist and racist culture that is the state, really, that is the United States. So I want to say that Indigenous peoples across the Americas and later African enslaved peoples became pawns in the machine that is ultimately formed the colonial and neo-colonial capitalism, militarism, and racist state that we have inherited. 1619, which most recently became a project within our consciousness that commemorates the arrival of the first slave ships on what is now the United States, is the fruit of preceding hundreds of years of a project of designed human hierarchy and racialized caste system. The transatlantic slave industry was that mechanism. Yet all along, enslaved Africans have always resisted. Resistance, rebellion, and revolt of a people enslaved and dehumanized is a high praise to the Creator, is an honor to human dignity. From trying to overthrow slavers on a ship to choosing death rather than enslavement, we saw revolts across the Caribbean, from St. John's in the Caribbean in 1733, to the Maroons of Jamaica, to the Haitian revolutions, to our ancestors on the southern plantocracy of the United States, who said it plainly: before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. It's important that we're not ahistorical and that we unearth narratives rooted in this legacy of dehumanization and violence against Black bodies. Facing difficult truths and hard facts is a very difficult thing for us to do, that is the United States to do as a society, and certainly the state. Truth has the greatest potential for reconciliation. When we think of every post-genocidal society, post-Holocaust, the most advancement towards peace is made when the victims and sufferers speak their truths and perpetrators listen and are ready to account. There tends to be the silencing of the voices of said victims. There tends to be deference to the sensibilities and fragility, the cloistering of the comforts of those who are in power. We see that currently when we focus on property destruction instead of the centuries of destruction of Black bodies, the pilfering of Black genius and Black cultures and Black wealth. We must come to terms with these atrocities. That means that we are not afraid to look at the roots of policing rooted in slave catching and other interlocking systems of containment, control, and subjugation of Black lives. From the school to prison pipeline, from redlining, where economic viability of property ownership in the United States have been blocked by coordinated efforts of financial institutions in collusion with the state. From cultural and educational and epistemic violences, that is worldview violences, where we do not even learn the truths of the history and the contributions of Black lives in the United States. People cannot breathe from the sidewalk to the workplaces, to schools, to the health and economic systems. People cannot breathe, as we saw recently, where Christian Cooper, a bird watcher in New York, could not breathe for the threat of Amy Cooper and her dog. The various ways our bodies are deemed a threat to white comforts are the ways in which we refuse as a people to continue to be subjugated to racism and white supremacy. I need not go through the litany of names of our slaughtered. Emmett Till was the Mike Brown, or Mike Brown was the Emmett Till in the historical consciousness and imagination of America, of the United States of America. George Floyd is reminiscent of Eric Garner. I need not go through the litany of names from Breonna Taylor of today to Sandra Bland of years past, to Ayanna Stanley Jones and countless of others who have not been able to live under the repression and the violence of racism in the United States. So we see that the civil rights movement wasn't enough. And so the current rising of people in the street is simply to say that we must breathe, that enough is enough, and that we cannot continue to live under the repression and the dehumanization of white supremacy. We also raise up to give voice and visibility, as our movement says in the movement of Black Lives, until Black people are free, no one is free. And we acknowledge the interlocking global oppression of militarism and white supremacy across the globe and in social movements. From indigenous peoples in the United States to the immigrants at the borderlands being caged, from the struggle in Palestine to the Roma peoples to the Dalit peoples of India, our movement represents saying that we cannot move forward as civilized humanity without having truth and reconciliation. It is only with truth and reconciliation that we can talk about promise of peace. And so with that, I will stop and defer to the next speaker. And as you can see, I am living a very intersectional life, being quarantined at home with my little one. Here, if you see a little body in the background. But thank you again for the opportunity to share, and I look forward to our engagement.
I want to thank you, Karlene. Dr. Karlene Soon, I'm looking forward to hearing the success of your PhD studies. So Dr. Karlene, thank you so much. I'm going to ask us to spend the next few minutes stepping out of our heads a little bit and giving space for our hearts and our ears to take over. And to do that, I'm going to ask you to join me as I reminisce on my experiences of racism in my 60 years of living on this earth. One of the struggles I have with Zoom and similar virtual meetings is you lose the intimacy of being in the space with each other. And so to the degree possible, I'm going to ask you to join me in this space as I look back on my life and how racism has shown up. And then what I really would love you all to do is to either in the chat or through your own individual thoughts, identify moments in your life where racism has shown up, regardless of being a perpetrator or recipient of it. Just reflect upon how you have engaged with racism in your experiences over the years. So as a little background, I'm born and raised in New York City, Brooklyn, New York, parents of a Southern-born father and a New York-born mom. My dad was born deep South, Alabama, and he came to the United States, came to New York after World War II. He met my mom and they married and found a home here in New York. Then they brought my sister and I into the world. At age 7, I have a very vivid memory of my dad saying, I want you all to see where I grew up. So we're gonna take a road trip. We're gonna drive down in his Buick 225, for those of you who remember the old big cars. And we're going to drive down to Alabama and you're going to see where I grew up. It's gonna take about 20 hours. So we're gonna stop along the way, stay the night, but you're really gonna get an experience that you wouldn't get here in New York. So we're excited. I'm 7, my sister is 3. My cousin, who was a little younger than me, joined us and we got in the car. And we're driving along and Dad said, okay, we're gonna stop and we're gonna stay here the night before we continue the trip. I look at my cousin, I don't say anything, but I say, we've only been in the car for 2.5, 3 hours. Why are we stopping so early? So we stopped in, I think it was Delaware or maybe Washington, D.C. I don't really remember, but that's where we stayed. And then we continued the trip. At some point, I got the nerve to ask Mom. I wasn't going to ask Dad, but I asked Mom when we were alone, why did we stop so early? We have so many more hours to go. And she said, we don't really have a place to stay after we leave D.C. What do you mean? There are hotels all along the path. I would assume. She said, well, Dad said that things are going to be different once we get past Maryland. And he's really concerned that if we try to get a hotel room in Maryland, we're not going to be able to. I said, why? Why not? Is it too expensive? She said, no. We're not allowed to stay in many of the hotels as we get further south. Why? Not because we can't afford it, but because of what we look like. As a 7-year-old who had an understanding of racism only from the distance, it was my first exposure to how racism shows up in everyday lives. We experienced Alabama in all of its glory. My dad was real proud to show us his home. But I noticed my dad's spirit to be very different than what I was used to up in New York. His body language was terribly slumped. His tone of voice was timid. And what I learned was that he had readjusted to growing up in the segregated South, to having to cross the street when a white person was on his corner or on his block. And to see your dad lose his humanity is hard for anyone, but a 7-year-old son who found so much pride in who his dad was, to see him feel victimed to the racism that he grew up in and to be reminded of it just in trying to take his son and his daughter to visit his hometown is something that has lived with me throughout my whole life and will continue to guide the work that I do today. I'm going to bring us fast forward a number of years and invite you to my love life. I fell in love with a Latin woman a number of years ago. Was super excited. She was the most amazing woman I had ever met. And I couldn't wait to bring her home. So I said, Mom, we're gonna have Yaya, is what I call her. I have a problem rolling my R's, so I won't try to pronounce her first name. So I said, we're gonna have dinner with Yaya. And my mama said, okay, looking forward to it. So we brought her home and I brought her home and we had a great dinner together. Everyone was friendly and laughing and we all felt spirited about this new relationship I was in. I took Yaya home and I came back home and there was heaviness in the house. You know, what did Yaya do wrong? I'm wondering. And I talked to my sister who's 4 years my junior. And I asked her, you know, I'm sensing something's wrong. And she said, don't you know? And I said, obviously not. What's going on? And she said to me, you have done what we all hoped you never would. I said, uh-oh, what did I do now? She said, you became a successful Black man and you're looking for love outside of your community. Racism shows up in so many ways. But to have my family struggle with my love for someone outside of my Black community is as much the racism that I experienced as when we went to Alabama. And then it was time for me to meet Yaya's family. And she told me as we were driving in the car, you might not be received real well. This is a Dominican family, skin tone darker than mine, but they have a preconceived understanding of what Black men are. And they're not going to be real happy that she's bringing one home as a potential husband. Racism permeates all communities. And as we continue to struggle through it, we have to understand what we're looking at. It is well beyond Black and white. It is so pervasive in almost every part of our existence that the challenge against it will be surmountable, but difficult. As Joe mentioned in my bio, I am committed to working with young people. And in 2014, I had probably about 15 young Black and Hispanic teenagers in a space together doing what we call Liberation Summer, where we learn about the issues around immigration and the criminal justice system and try to find our space for change making. Woke up one morning getting ready for the camp to see the video of Eric Gardner being choked to death. I took a deep breath and I said, this is gonna be one interesting session when I get to camp. Got there, and not to my surprise, the anger, the fear, the frustration, the need to retaliate was in everyone's heart. And I had the onus, which was an unbelievable one, to talk about beyond the racism and how do we not retaliate in violence. Racism brings out the worst in all of us. It enables us to step outside of what we know is right and want to viscerally and understandably retaliate. As we continue this challenge, we have to find that space to honor those feelings, sometimes get out of the way of those feelings, but find those moments where we can reconvene what we know is right. And that is the peaceful, effective response. That is all that we have known to be successful. I'm going to talk about another experience. This one is a little harder to share, but I'm going to do it anyway. Throughout my career, there was something in me that thought that the clergy was where I belonged. So I decided to apply to Princeton Theological Seminary. Got admitted. Went to orientation, sat in a large church congregational space with about 40 to 50 other newly admitted students. I was the only one of color. The provost of the school, standing in the front at the lectern, told the group that they are lucky to have me because now they'll learn how to preach. Built into that for me was some pride because yes, my people do know how to talk to people. But also in his response was embarrassment. Was I there because I was Black? Or was I there because I could bring my faith to a community regardless of my skin color? I don't know the answer to that. I decided not to attend the seminary. But to be in that space and to be singled out only because of my Blackness was once again an example of the racism that has been part of my life since 1962. I don't know what to do about the police killings. I don't know how we should respond. I certainly support every action that I've seen, both peaceful and maybe a little less than peaceful. But what I do know is that the only real way forward is for us to start within. As I looked around the gallery in this Zoom meeting or webinar, I saw a lot of people who might not have had my experiences. But there's something about you being in this meeting tells me that you understand. I need to believe that. I deeply need to believe that you don't have to look like me or have had my experiences to know what we're talking about, to know what we're up against, and to care enough to engage. So I know there's going to be an opportunity for reflections and, suggestions for engagement. But as I close, I would just urge you to start by, finding those moments in your story where you experienced racism as a perpetrator or recipient. And with that, I want to thank you all.
Louis, thank you. And that was eloquent, deeply moving. And thank you for sharing out of your life. I could say more, but we'll move on. But just to thank you so much. And then to move on to Jim Anderson.
Breonna Taylor. Am I still muted? Can you hear me?
Nope, you're good. Yes.
Oh, okay. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. My name is Jim Anderson. I want to reiterate who I am. I am the National Vice President for Peace Action here in the States. I'm the president of Peace Action New York State. I am a council member of Abolition 2000. I'm a board member of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. I am the state vice president for Citizen Action of New York, which is a social justice group. I am a founding organizer and member of the National Black United Front, and I am a combat veteran of Vietnam, and I am pleased to be here with this family from all over the world. I want to start out by saying that we're in a moment that is a month, I want to tell you, that is one of great memory for me. It was June in 1964 when Lorraine Hansberry had produced her play, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. She also responded to an editorial that was in the New York Times, because the New York Times had talked about, like we hear some people talking about today, oh, those, and they didn't use these words, but I'm paraphrasing, using words of the day. These animals shouldn't be in the street. Look at them. Why are they looting? Why are they tearing up these things? It was a reaction, and then with the same reaction today, people are acting like people of color just got up and decided to do something to make the United States upset. I want to add to this another date. It was June 12th, 1982. It was the greatest thus far here in the United States anti-nuclear march in New York City. And the same conditions existed then. And what was that? The impact of racism, not only at home, but abroad too, because I told you I was a combat veteran of Vietnam and I traveled the world. So this evening for some, I may step on your toes, but it's lovingly. Consider it a wake-up call. Because we're in the same place that we were when Lorraine wrote spoke her concerns about the article in the New York Times. We're in the same place that we're confronting and dealing with white liberals who mean well, but don't do well. Because the moment now calls for white liberals to move from that liberal spot and become white radicals. Whoa. You don't want people to do anything crazy? No. I want people here in the States to do what the frameworking papers that set and guide this country cause us to do. It says whenever a government ceases to serve its people, it is your duty. They don't say a recommendation, it is your duty to overturn or abolish that government. And what are the processes? For us to assemble in the street and for us to use the ballot box. Well, we did all of that. Some people still saying, well, y'all need to vote. We vote, but guess what? Many whites didn't vote with us. Some folks say, well, you need to talk. We've talked. We tried, as Lorraine said, every form of communication and transformation, right on down to kneeling in the street, hands up, and we weren't heard. But here's the uniqueness of our moment, because this is an impregnated moment. People who know me, I like to say that. This is a very impregnated impregnated moment for us to deliver something. This is also a fertile moment. Let me start with the fertile. The fertile moment is that what you see in the street are mainly the generation who heard what we spoke about but didn't do about. They heard it, they witnessed it. And now that they have grown to a point of where they can do something, they're doing it, and they're not willing to accept what even some of us accepted coming down this way, dealing with these struggles. Practicing what I call excusiology about why we can't do this. Too comfortable in our job, too clutching of our property. And it's blinding us in a moment of need and in a moment of change and in a decade that will not allow us to pull a wagon in full of the stuff that we've been pulling. Now it's the time to let go and to pick up the new order of how we must change, and that must be in the streets. Now you say, why in the streets? Because they start paying attention to them. Yes, there'll be trouble. There'll be some things said and done that people get a little squirmish about. But change is not going to come by people wishing that people would do better. Change is going to come by when we hold people accountable, when we change the policies that affect us, and when we stop sitting back wondering why things can't get better. We need to look at ourselves and say, what are we doing? I know I'm coming to the end of what I need to say, but let me add to this. Because we talk about the infrastructure of our world at home and abroad. And true, all over the world in communities just like mine, people are resisting statesmanship-less politicians and greedy corporate people. In communities like mine, all over the world, those political figures that they're confronting is no different than the character that we have here in the US in the White House. The problem is we have not done well in connecting those dots. Going back, 1982, the anti-nuclear march. What have we done to connect the dots to the Black issue? Really? That, you don't have to answer that, I'm gonna tell you. Nothing. In 1967, when Dr. King spoke at Riverside Church, remember when he came there, he understood the economic connections between the Poor People's Campaign then and the money that was being wasted to make war. But on the peace movement side, we have yet to go to the social justice movements and really show that we understand the connection. We haven't went into those ranks to teach them. We got a couple of favorites we like. It's easy to talk about climate. We talk a little bit about immigration, but all the ills that are impacting communities of color, when it comes to the finances needed for education, for healthcare, for housing, for money to invest in the infrastructure of communities, a lot of it is in the Pentagon budget, and the other are with the big greedy CEO. So what must we do in this moment? We need to stop coming to actions like this new mode of being on Zoom in meetings. We come to it like it's entertainment when we should be coming to it for entertainment, so that when we leave here in this impregnated moment, it can be seen what we deliver. Thank you.
Jim, thank you for that. You put everybody on notice here, and you really spoke from your heart. And I really appreciate that. I'm kind of playing with my computer at the moment so I can see everybody again. Give me a second. Okay, so thank you. We move now to a Q&A session with a somewhat awkward system here. So I'm going to ask Sean to help me to identify people. You can try to, on the one hand, use the raising your hands function by going to the participants button at the bottom of your screen, and then going over to the right side, of your computer where you should see a hand appear. If that won't work for you, just raise your hand like this, and we'll move back and forth across the screen here to try to identify people to ask questions. I want to ask that you keep your comments to no more than 2 minutes, so that we really have a chance to have a discussion that involves everybody. And I want to ask people to be especially sensitive to the moment. I did see one email earlier that I thought just really did not reflect the the understanding of the sensitivity that is called for, not just today but every day. So Sean, if you'll help me look for hands in terms of who we should be calling on.
Yes, I am not seeing any hands at the moment here. Give it a second, maybe, people to find the feature there. Let me just look around.
And it might also be appropriate just to share a little bit in terms of some of your experiences at demonstrations and protests over the last couple of days to let people know with a wider perspective of what's going on.
I think I did see a hand from Joan. I don't know if you were, yeah, that is a hand.
Okay, thank you. So Joan, can we give her can you unmute her?
Joan. All right, there's quite a few names here. There she is. Yep, unmuted.
Go ahead, Joan.
Not getting any.
Sorry, this is a little-
Yeah.
Others?
I see two hands now. I see Melvin Hardy and Anthony Donovan. We'll start with Melvin.
Yep, good.
Hold on.
Mel, can you get in?
This is Mel Hardy. I'm in DC. The question to our presenters is, we all understand the history. We've had a lot of content to help guide our discussion. The 1619 Project has been referenced. Yesterday's article in the New York Times to retranslate the word racism into anti-Blackness. That we're seeing some other events coming from London. We see that the Chinese are expelling Africans and African Americans out of China because they're being blamed for the coronavirus in Guangzhou. So there's a lot of content around this. And so looking at the protests, these actions across our nation that has a character that may be distinctively different from that which we know from the leading up to the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act. How can we translate what we see today into coalition building and mobilizing around the primacy of hopefulness to energize our activism?
Why don't we take the second question and then go back to our presenters to respond to them.
That's me. I actually thank you very much. Thank you, Karlene, Jim, and Louis so much. Very deep, and thank you, Joseph. I actually raised my hand because there was no one raising their hands. I'm out there every day. We have vigils on corners every day with our Black Lives Matter, but also joining the protests and discerning the destructive elements from the vast majority who are just standing up and saying we've had enough. So our solidarity in the curfew, which is the first curfew I've ever experienced in New York City. I'm 68. There's never been one here before. Really bugs the heck out of me because it's separating the older generation from the youth. And I think it's really important for the youth to feel our support, just about everyone on this Zoom call, to feel our presence with them. And they're basically saying, go to your rooms. And so I've been getting out there when I can. And white privilege, I have not been bothered. But if you're in a group, it's different. But I just I raised my hand just to bring in the Kings Bay Plowshares, who went in to the naval base, as most of you who know them, with a banner of Martin Luther King. The triplets were primed to their activism. And they still, they put out a statement, of course, 2 days ago about the killing of George. So I just wanted to throw that in there, and that we are, as much as we can, this is an uplifting moment for all of us to get out there and get involved, get on our street corners in any way, right? And God bless. So that's it for now.
Anthony, thank you. And for the benefit of people on the call, those triplets were the triplets of evil: racism, poverty, and extreme materialism.
Thank you.
Let me ask our speakers to, in no particular order, to respond to Mel's question and Anthony's comment.
I have one. Well, this is Jim. I think there is a part of us that has to really dig into it, because when I talk about how we want this to be a kind of feel-good moment, it's not going to be. We've done too many walk-bys, too many passing bys of this situation to be blurry-eyed. And so I side with the young people. This is a moment, quite honestly, even in this Zoom call, when I have to say, in the spirit of Greta, how dare us act as if we don't recognize what we're seeing. What we're dealing with is the need to reconcile with our own, maybe lower than we would have liked it to be, participation. But this is the moment we're being called forward. And we're being called forward by those who don't even know all of the history. They just know they are sick and tired of taking and hearing us in this generation talk about how long this has been going on, and them not seeing a real strong confronting of it. It's been boiling. The question is, what have we been looking at? And the reason that we seem to have a disconnect from that generation, other than knowing that they're right and want to roll with them, is that we haven't been in those pockets long enough with them to wrestle with them. Look, as a person of color, let me tell you how, even within our rank, we say we want to hear the voices of the young people. When we started talking about we wanted young folks and more people of color, people said, well, I reached out to communities of color. Well, I dare you to look at yourself and really look at, how did you reach out to your communities of color versus how you reach out to young folks? When we're in meetings, we even squash voices. We say, well, we want to hear from the young people. Well, you know where the young people got their information from? From those of us in our generation who knew and told. Don't shut us up. Expand our environments to hear it all, because if it's going to get better, it has to get better for all. And we have to fashion our ears to hear, but we have to get our physicalness on the front lines with them. I hope that answers some of it. It's about us, y'all. None of us should be able to say, I don't understand why they're doing that. If we don't understand that, we're not being true to ourselves, and we need to do more work.
I think kind of going in two different directions. I mean, I just want to say that, this call was in many ways initiated by the International Peace Bureau with a desire for people outside the United States to have an understanding of what's happening here. And I would encourage European participants in this webinar to be sharing your responses and your thinking and questioning. think also, as we've heard from each of our speakers, the question really is for all of us here, what are we going to do in the moment, not only in the streets, but how do we change our lives? How do we change the way we organize? How do we change what it is that we do? Because, as Jim was saying, in terms of, just kind of a white liberal approach won't work. I mean, it requires fundamental change. So I'll ask Louis. Karlene, do you want to come in?
I do, and I'm really heartened by.
You have to speak up. You have to speak up as much as you can, Karlene.
Okay. Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yes.
I'm really thankful for, I want to call you Reverend Jim, but I'm not sure if that's appropriate. But, I have in Boston, as part of Black Lives Matter Boston, and the movement for Black Lives have been so really energized by young people. And I'm not a millennial, I'm before millennial. And, but it's even the generations that are younger than millennials and younger than that, the generation following, who have listened, who have heard, and who, for some reason, dare to believe that what previous generations thought were impossible, they believe that it is possible. We were contacted as an organization by 3 Boston University college students who had put a flyer out because they wanted to do something. It was intuitive to act with what is happening based on personal experiences in their own communities, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, policing, the mistreatment of Black youth in our own communities, and the poverty and dehumanization and lack of access, and on, a litany of social marginalization that they saw around us. And shortly after they put the flyer out, thinking they'd only get a few college students who would join them in Nubian Square in Roxbury to raise their voices, they received thousands and thousands of responses. They reached out to BLM and other known organizations, and we supported and undergirded their leadership. Our demands and our asks are things like defund police. It is clear to see that policing does not benefit and have never benefited the communities that we come from. So asking to defund the police is unpalatable to liberal and neoliberal and to a broad cross-section of people. But we see that even in Minnesota, for the University of Minnesota to say we are not going to renew our contract with police is a huge win. Harvard police showed up at a rally in Franklin Park, another rally that we had on Monday. And we're asking, and one of the demands of the movement for Black Lives is that universities, colleges do not contract police to police students on campus. And so what am I saying? I'm saying that there are demands, if we listen very carefully, young people in particular are moving us along the trajectory of what is possible. We believe that a better world, another world beyond the one that has been given us, acknowledging that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. We believe that world is possible. We believe that it must come. A world that does not cage people, that abolishing prisons is a possible thing that we can do. To remove policing from our schools and redirect funds given to the military and to the war industrial complex and putting it in education and giving it to communities to engage a community budgeting process based on our own priorities, our own agency, our own genius. We believe that that is possible. We believe fighting for these legislations and putting local leaders and politicians in office, like Ayanna Pressley and the radical agenda, right? We believe that that is possible. And so if nothing else, what I'm saying is do the introspection and retrospective and introspective work, retrospective and introspective work to galvanize the courage of these convictions and join us in the streets. Join us as we believe that we can not just transform, but change the society that we live in through these very real and possible demands that you will find in the movement for Black Lives. You'll find on the pages of Black Lives Matter. I have had calls from India, from Norway, from comrades in Italy, were the first to reach out to me to say, what can we do, right? What can we do? How can we join and support you? I've had calls from Geneva, right, to ask, how can we organize to be in support of Black lives? And so I'll stop there, but this is the time and this is the moment. And there are great opportunities now to move the markers of history forward, not just for Black people, but for all of us.
So as we move to Sean and Esky to help me to find other hands here, just a couple
Can
things
I just share a little
say.
bit?
Who's this?
This is Lewis, I'm sorry.
Okay, please, I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just think it's important as we talk about showing up to the protest of today, that we have to understand that this movement is very different than the civil rights movement. This one is not as hierarchical. We don't have an identifiable organizer, an identifiable leader. So as we show up, and we have to understand that we're bringing an image with us, be it older Black people who bring the image of a movement that didn't work as far as young people are concerned. So when we show up, we can't assume to be trusted and welcome. If you show up as a white person, you have to understand that there's going to be a lack of distrust. You don't have that central figure who's going to buffer that and, you know, encourage people to be welcoming. So showing up is great, but showing up rightly is more important. So I just ask us to be mindful of that.
If I may just briefly say something, because I think your point is relevant. If you do not have relationships on the ground with organizers, the difference, I think, in a leaderful, non-hierarchical, being led by women, queer, non-binary, poor and working class, trans, a broader, fuller cross-section of our community, and recognizing that there's genius and leadership in all of us. We have elders, we have OGs, that the difference is that they're willing to build relationships with us outside of the moment of crisis. They are willing to listen and honor what younger people bring as well. And so there's more of a mutuality rather than simply deference to age or deference to, I marched with Martin Luther King. There is all of that. And I'm one who loves the interconnectedness and intergenerationality of our communities. I love our elders. I love those who have gone before us. And many of us do. But what is key and critical is to recognize that the organizing that you are seeing is not disorganization. It's that a lot of the work happens day in, day out, behind the scenes. We're building relationships with folk we're not calling allies. We're calling and calling for them to become freedom fighters, who are white folks, right? And who are willing to show up and listen and learn and occupy the stations and that we ask or that we need. We have plenty of that happening, and it's a beautiful struggle. It's interracial, it is multicultural, it is cross-movement. And so from where I sit within the movement for Black Lives, within Black Lives Matter, on the ground in multiple cities across the United States and beyond the United States. Yes, it's not perfect, but we do have white comrades. We do have white accomplices. We do have white freedom fighters. We have Palestinians. We have Dalits. We have Roma people. We have others from across the world. And we are organized. And no, you won't be able to identify this one male charismatic leader because that doesn't exist anymore. There's a multiplicity of us, full of leadership and genius, and that's what we bring. So we welcome you, but first build the relationship on the ground when the cameras aren't there.
Thank you. Other hands? Looking for
So
other
I
hands
think
here.
I think Joan had wanted to say something before. We have her unmuted. Joan, do you have a question?
Yes, I was interested that Jim mentioned common security because I think that was so important. All of Palmer's submission to the United Nations, where it extended the notion of security way beyond militarized security and was suggesting peace, environment, social justice, and human rights. And as you probably remember, one of the reasons the NATO countries said, non-nuclear NATO countries said they would not sign the prohibition of nuclear weapons was they said the US nuclear weapons are necessary for our security. So it's so important to redefine security and take it back. It's related to anti-racism. It's related to all the things that we've been struggling for years. And I just wanted to make some response to Lewis, is that my father worked at the UN in 1946. And I found out when I was 8 years old that the Black and colored delegates could not find accommodation on Long Island. And they had to rent the Lido Beach Hotel to house the delegates. And that was my first exposure to racism. And it was just terrible. And ironically, the UN Declaration of Human Rights was negotiated in the Lido Beach Hotel, it completely ignoring all the racism surrounding them in New York area. I want to mention that.
Thank you, Joan. Other hands? Joan, are you seeing any?
I do want to say something. I hope folks don't be afraid to say anything, but I'm a radio host also, and I know sometimes when people don't call in, it don't mean they're not paying attention. It's just that transition within that's going on, and that's fine. But I want to point out something, because in this moment, you need to understand that truth is not constrained by ethnicity. The reason I say that, I know that there are some people who are not of color who feel like they can't speak on certain subjects because why? If it's the truth, if it needs to be known, you need to share it. You need to figure out how do you deliver it. Just about going to join up with rallies and actions that are on the street. If you don't know where you're going, don't go. And if you don't know why you're going, don't go. It is important to when we begin to engage, and I mean, think about what you bring. We know something about war. We know war isn't working. We know in every country where, well, particularly here, but in every country where there are war monuments, there are too many monuments to war. So we know war is not working. We need to help the young people who don't really know. We need to connect that, but we need to connect it along the money trail. When I say money trail, in the social justice movement, they talk about runaway inequality, how the money has been taken out of our streams, workers losing salaries, low salaries, all the stuff that takes away the economics we need. In our movement, the peace movement, we talk about move the money. Well, what about move the money? It's part of runaway inequality. If we could help our social justice group to understand that a large portion of the funds that they could really get and need has been given to the Pentagon budget. When they see a budget where going to war and we're not in no war and trying to stay in create a culture of peace, why are we spending so much money on the Pentagon budget and 5%, 3% on education or healthcare or energy? We need to be clear and strong on that and take it into these different pockets and talk to them. When you talk to them about immigration, why aren't we helping folks to understand that those who are leaving their countries are not leaving it because they want to get away? It's mainly because of the military terrible things we're doing in their country. When we talk about the climate, all of this stuff is already clear before us. This is why we, in some ways, we almost train ourselves to be blind. We see these things, and many on this call have been on the planet long enough and have seen it so long that that's why I say you have no excuse. It's time to muscle up. And I don't just mean physically, but I mean with a heart and a mind, and to understand, look, this situation we in, we didn't get in it overnight. We won't get out overnight. But there's a wise tale or a wise proverb that is attributed to people of color. And it says, when your hand is in the lion's mouth, you have to be careful how you pull it out. Well, our hand is in the lion's mouth of our own economic stability. That's what's troubling some. They're not even going to move that hand. They ain't even think about how to get it out. I'm not talking about people who know they have been investing in some things that they shouldn't. But I'm just saying, now's the time to get our house in order, the infrastructure stronger, and to invest with Black voices, not the tokenism, not for the picture, have them there as part of the action leading the way. We're practicing that in the organizations that I align with. We're practicing that, maybe not always as best as we can, but we're all trying to get there. We're bumping into each other, but you know what? We know together we do better. And together we'll win this thing and we'll prevail. We'll have that new world, a better world and better people. But we have to do the preparation within. We can do this.
Let me just jump in for half a second, kind of following on something that Karlene has said. You know, in addition to coming out into the streets, and we need to be thoughtful and do that as we can, you know, there are other things that people can do today and going into the future. So reference was made to Ayanna Pressley. You know, one of the things that I've been learning in the last couple of weeks is about the series of laws that have been passed by Congress that basically give immunity to police and to police violence. And this has developed now over decades. Well, Ayanna Pressley and others have now introduced legislation to remove that immunity. And, you know, everybody, at least here in the United States, who's on the call in this webinar, you know, should be contacting your members of Congress and talking to members of your community, urging that they should support that, you know, that they should get their congressional representatives to support that legislation. I think also just to say that Jim was talking about move the money. Look, the reality is that with the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis that's followed, we've got huge debt and an expectation that we're going to have an intense fight over national budget priorities in the next Congress. The military-industrial complex is already racing Pentagon contracts through because they're afraid, on the one hand, of the financial limitations, on the other hand, the possibility that Democrats might win, and they want to get those contracts in place. And you know, what we've seen from not only Republicans, but certainly from Republicans over years, has been the effort to basically make our government a coercive government, that its only resources, the only services, not that you can call that a service, is coercive, the police and the military, rather than investing in healthcare, in housing, in food, in education, and all the things that people really need. So that's a fight that we're going to have. And so what I said before, I think it's really important for us to understand that this is a struggle in the moment, and it's a longer struggle as well. Sean, did you see other hands? Yeah,
it seems we've had a few come up now. I also see that a few people have have unmuted themselves. I don't know if that is their way of saying they have something to ask, but we have 4 hands up and then a couple of people who are unmuted here. So I can start, have a little list here in the order I've seen them anyways, hoping it's as fair as possible. We had Rena Baskin. Do you have something to share?
Yes, I do. I feel as if we need a Department of Peace in this country. And I believe it was Dennis Kucinich years ago, I'm not sure if that's right, who brought that to the fore. And it just, to me, I think that would be a wonderful way to kind of combine all of the things that would create peace, like, you know, anti-racism and all these other things. If there is some way to come together with all the groups that are trying to create peace on earth, in one way or another, that would be a great way to start. If we could get a government that would focus on that. And of course, in order to do that, part of that would have to be, as Joe said, healthcare for everyone. I mean, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you have no health, if you are being discriminated against, all of those things cannot be given to us without that. So I just wanted to throw out the idea of, you know, whatever happened to the Department of Peace, and why don't we have one, and can we get one?
We have one.
Next, Sean.
So next would be Felix Jimenez.
Hello, everyone. I am teaching in Japan now, and my way of bringing the issue of racism in the United States to the fore to my students, who are very removed from everything that's going on, is to frame it as an issue of human rights. Most of them have never met a Black person. This is a very rural area. But something that strikes me is that human rights does not seem to be a big rallying cry in the streets. And I would like to ask if the activists, Jim, Karlene, and the others who've been speaking, if they could tell me, because I mean, the United States has signed numerous human rights treaties. There's a whole list of them, and the murders of African Americans in the streets are in clear violations of these treaties. Also, there's a whole literature on transitional justice, which would go a long ways against the immunity police officers. So, is there an attempt to challenge all this through the courts, through the law, using the established framework of a human rights system that has been in place since at least the 1960s?
There is. I mean, right now, what you just described to me, how it came to in my mind to where we're trying to get is that mountaintop that people want to get to. But you can't get to the mountaintop without going through the valley. We're still in the valley. We're still having to traverse those trails to get up there. And it's a struggle. I'm in my faith walk. I'm a Christian. In the book that I read, it tells me that the Creator, he said, in the world, you're gonna have trials and tribulation, not a skip through the park. We have to understand that there are some people among us who mean to do bad, who have intentions of doing bad. One of them is in the White House with a bunch of others like him around him. And we're having to face the same question that Sean Connery and Kevin Costner had to face in the movie The Untouchable. No matter what the situation is, that same question is upon us. And then this is why I keep bringing it back to us, because the question is, what are you prepared to do? Even as we talk about a Department of Peace, that's fine, yes. But what we're doing in the street could be translated as the front end work of creating a Department of Peace.
I think we got time maybe for 2 more questions, and then I think we will move to Philip. Sean?
Karlene, you look like you have something to add.
Quickly, in response to the human rights question. And fundamentally, we are doing human rights, but the United States, based on its foundation that I delineated earlier, Black folk in particular have to continue to remind the government, the state, that Black people are human too. And so, because it was predicated on the fact, the founding of this country was predicated on the fact that we were not, and largely in the organizational, systemic, and structural construct of the state, we still are not. And so these violences, we're seeing the police, and then all of the systemic violences are structural, reinforces this premise that Black people are not human. So our struggle is firmly grounded in human rights. I can say more because there's a long history directly connected to the UN and the Declaration of Human Rights, but for sake of time and brevity, I just needed to say that everything we do is to affirm our humanity and within the constructs of human rights.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so maybe then the last question.
All right, the last question then will be from Alicia Sanders.
Hi there, this is Alicia calling in from Geneva. I work with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons here. And I'm just interested in hearing from the panelists about how international folks can stand and work in solidarity with the movement for Black lives in the US. Thanks.
Karlene?
Yes. You know, one of the things that I think it's not just international folks, but for here, for the United States as well, we ask people to use your privilege and power where you are. There is, you know, a lot of information that we have published, the movement for Black Lives. You can see our campaign, you can see our asks and demands. How can you use your power within your own organization? From policies to representation to targeting the governing bodies and infrastructures that do not align with human rights for Indigenous, Black, and Brown folk. I think a part of it is that there's one dimension of coming and aligning with us in our movement when we're rising up and standing with us and having an assignment. It's another to use your own power within your own sphere of influence and challenge your own people. And that is that, you know, there are Amy Coopers in everyone's families. There are Donald Trumps from your family to your organization, and that you are taking the risk and you are fighting the good fight for racial peace and equality when you use your power in your own time, in your network, in your own neighborhood, so to speak.
Yeah, if I may?
Please go.
Yeah, I think that for me, the biggest opportunity for the international community in this moment is to fill a void. We have, you all have, I should say, allowed America to stand at a level of superiority in the world that it does not deserve. Your deference to our leaders, your acceptance of our money, your agreements with our practices does not sit well in community. So where there is opportunity to challenge America as the leader of democracy, as the beacon of wellness, is what I would ask. I would ask international communities to not accept the rhetoric that comes from our leaders, but challenge them at every opportunity.
Wow. I would add into that, listen, you're already doing it, my young sister. The reason I say you're already doing it, well, I may not have been to your home, but I've been to Japan, I've been to France, I've been throughout all throughout Guam, I've been to Philippines. I ain't gonna tell you where all the places I've been, but what I'm saying, while I was there, I've seen what it's the same struggle we're going on. The best thing you could do is connect, you know how you're dealing with, as I said earlier, the same economic strife that is happening in your own places, and the same kind of, that the corporate industry and the political who are part of the problem for the community below it. It's the same thing here. We need to start in all of our communities making it clear that the people of the world are not really hearing each other. We're hearing these false leaders say things. So when the Sekou in the White House said negative things about China, that's not necessarily the people of the US. But the danger is that those who know it's not aren't doing enough to revive the consciousness of those who might wind up saying, yeah, going right along with that crazy talk. That's what we have. We're in a moment of see something, say something. And in all of our countries, we have those who have got comfortable with, well, I got mine, so I'm not worried. We have to, again, find a way to challenge them without losing focus of what we're trying to do. There are some things that are you're gonna wake up someday, do good work, and think that you didn't do anything, but you're really a seed planter. Right now, your voice, your generation, is the blooming of the seeds that were planted by the adults who cried out in their pain, out of the communities who in their pain came together and organized the protest. And in the consciousness of their protest realized that, you know what? We're moving from pain to protest. And now we're gonna move to power. Remember those two things I said that we have the ability to do here in the States? When we assemble in mass, that's protest, but there's also education going on. And when we get wise enough and collectively use the ballot box, we'll make some changes. I'll end by saying that the boat of peace that we all want to get in to get to the destination we want to get to can get there, but we got to change the crew. It's mainly at the political level, and it's mainly with these corporations who operate for greed, but not for the benefit of humanity.
Thank you, Jim. You know, and that also serves as a transition, you know, to another truly international voice. So I want to ask Philip Jennings, who is the co-president of International Peace Bureau and a major international labor organizer, to help us move toward closing. Philip? You're muted.
He's muted.
Still muted. Sean, can you unmute him?
I'm trying. It's not doing it.
Look at the top of your screen, Philip. Maybe you could find that little.
Am I coming
There
through?
you go.
There you are.
Yes.
Okay.
Here we got it.
Okay. I'm not used to giving speeches from my bedroom, everybody. I'm not used to giving speeches sitting down in what was once my beautiful daughter's bedroom. I have a number of things I want to communicate to the panelists and to everybody who's listening in. We can bring change. I spent my life in the labor movement, a life of struggle. I remember the struggle in South Korea just 2, 3, 4 years ago, when hundreds of thousands of South Koreans got hold of a candle, walked into that street, and the despot that was President Park had to leave office. I remember my days in South Africa in the 1980s, and we were wondering, will this nation ever be free? I met Mr. Mandela and others, and one day they were free. And one of my labor organizers queued for 12 hours with the pencil that I gave her to tick that ballot box. I remember the Also, I recall Colombia. They killed 3,700 people, like all of us, like me, labor organizers. I was threatened. They got a peace deal. I remember talking to young women in a supermarket, all of them aged under 25. And they said, Philip, if we stand, we lose our life. They stood. And now there's 15,000 young women who've got a collective bargaining agreement. Can be done. Tunisia, the same. We stood with the workers in Poland when, and then eventually the Berlin Wall fell. In Tunisia, a massive union demonstration turned on the president's palace and he fled the country and they won a Nobel Peace Prize. Just 6 years ago in Bangladesh, we mentioned Bangladesh at the opening there, 1,134 Bangladeshi workers lost their lives, 10 times more than the shirtwaist factory of New York. And we said, we're going to change the rules of the game here. We ain't going to take big business word for it that these places are safe and secure. And we managed to get a global agreement. And now we are close to a globally, legally binding agreement. We trained up nearly 2 million Bangladeshi garment workers. We can bring change. We can do it. And I love the spirit that each of you have demonstrated today. I want to thank you for inviting Lewis, for inviting us into your space. I want to thank you for inviting us into your experiences. Thank you for sharing your lives of and for lifting up the stone on the rotten lie that is the United States of America in its treatment of Black people. You've been honest. It's been searing. This has been life in the raw. And if people are rocking on their chairs at home and still muted, it's because you've struck a chord. You've hit home. You've muscled us up, as Jim said. So I thank you for your contribution to Karlene, to Lewis, to Jim, and to Joseph. I want to thank all of those that have joined into this conversation today. I want to say to you in the United States of America, the world is listening. The world is protesting, and that the world is on your side. We are moved by your passion, by your anger, by your struggle spirit. And I'm also reminded of the words of Nelson Mandela when he said, never give up, never surrender, and rise up against the odds. Sisters and brothers, that is you. You are living in the spirit of Mandela. We are proud of you. We are proud of the rainbow of people that you brought together out into the streets, defiant, inspiring, energizing, electrifying. The International Peace Bureau is the oldest of the peace NGOs in the world. We've been around an awful long time, since 1892. We won the Nobel Peace Prize many years ago. We are part of the peace movement. We persist. We are for peace, against war. We're against violence, the violence of war, for disarmament, for human rights and democracy. We are against militarization. And I'm pleased, Karlene, when you say these words of resistance and rebellion and revolt. They enthuse us, they inspire us. We are part of a movement with the labor movement global, the environmentalists and the human rights movement, that we fought colonialism, that we fight against militarism, and above all, we fight this new generation of dictators to which I will refer. Our basic message to you is very, very clear. Solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. We mourn the loss of George Floyd and all those that have been slaughtered so brutally. I think it's a revelation to people when they understand that this slaughter is 400 years old since the first slaves set foot on American soil. This is not an isolated incident, and you communicated this to us. This is part of history. This is the legacy of this nation. And that we also say, as a peace movement, that Black Lives Matter in the United States of America and Black Lives Matter in every corner of this planet, and in every corner of this planet, they face discrimination. Now, when Donald Trump stood on the steps of St. John's Church in Lafayette Square, which I know well. He wasn't just seeking to intimidate you. He was seeking to intimidate the world. And we saw this despot stand there to impress his fascist dictator friends and business friends around the world. He wanted to demonstrate that this is how authoritarian leaders can suppress and threaten and make us cower. Well, I can say, Mr. Trump, you have failed. And I was pleased when I think Jim mentioned the Declaration of Independence from 1776. And I just so happened to have a quote from the Declaration of Independence. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of free people. Mr. Trump, you are unfit to be the president of a free people. Our message to Donald Trump, I remember from the picket lines. One day longer, each day stronger, Mr. Trump. We have beaten the fascists in the past and we will beat them again. We stand together, we shall overcome, we shall not be moved. And as the theme of this webinar says, no justice, no peace. And we know that poverty anywhere is a threat to prosperity everywhere. Now we have the age, the era of COVID-19. And the cry in response has been a just recovery, build back better. We have to combine this anger, this discrimination, this racism in that policy platform to build back better. None of us must accept business as usual. When that police officer put his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, what you have communicated to us, that knee has been on the neck of Black people for some 400 years. I thank you for not taking then this tragedy in isolation and for bringing home to us these fault lines that exist in your society and in your nation. I know from my own union experience, we have social and economic fault lines in this world, but they're not just fault lines where the plates rub together gently. What we have is an eruption. We have what I call a lava flow of economic violence and injustice, overwhelming generation after generation. And with COVID-19, it is shocking for us to see that more Black people fall ill, that more Black people die from this disease than any other ethnic group. And then when we look to the States and the world, we have a wealth gap, a jobs gap, a wages gap, a decent work gap, an education gap, a power gap. I was amazed to discover myself there have been 9 Black senators in 150 years of the US Senate. For goodness sake, 9 in 150 years. Shame. We have the healthcare gap, a housing gap, and a justice gap, and therefore the causality between death and suffering is clear in this time. And yet, people applaud the essential workers. 75% of the essential workers in New York City are Black and Hispanic. We don't get treated as essential workers. I know I organize security guards and cleaners and healthcare workers. We don't get treated in a non-essential, we get treated in a non-essential way. And all of this backed up by the brutality of the police. You have no freedom from fear. And taking all of this together, we don't just have a gap, we have a hole. So I asked myself, what does the world think? You may be thinking, what does the world think of the USA? What do we think of the state of play in the USA? So I found a table. It's called the Global Peace Index. 163 nations are on the Global Peace Index. America is ranked 128th. Now, I know reference was made to America, the leading economic power and so on, and there are so many good things in the nation, but you're ranked 128th. But guess where you're ranked first? You are #1 in spending on militarization and military expenditure. $750 billion gets spent in America every year on weapons and arms and nuclear weapons. So if we build back better, the solution will fail unless we address racism and discrimination. The civil society of this world is not diminished by the challenges that we face. And I must say that your courage inspires us, and we're inspired always by the message, another world is possible. We have a multitude of ideas, and don't think the people are not taking a stand. We saw more civil protests last year than we've seen in a generation. And this year is anticipated to be even more until we were struck by the COVID story. We have a multitude of ideas. We are not bereft of ideas. We must not be bereft of courage. And we must not be wanting in putting the question. We have ideas on a sustainable planet, for economic justice, for healthcare for all, for education for all, for justice for all, for our democracies and for our freedom, and also a big agenda for change for the business community, as well as where there must be a legal obligation upon all businesses everywhere to respect the human rights, whoever they work with and anyone in their supply chain. George Floyd said, "I cannot breathe, I cannot breathe." Well, I can say from the civil society's perspective and from the International Peace Bureau and our 300 members in countries around the world that we have not had our breath taken away, that our will is not broken, that we will plot, we will plan, we will strategize, we will organize, and we will mobilize. And in closing, there must be a call to action. And I want the IPB to take the message to global leaders that you keep the military off our streets. Keep the military off our streets. We reject the militarization of police, that there's time to change, that the policeman should not see himself as a warrior going into combat. Why don't they see themselves as peacekeepers? In our midst, we have peacekeepers all over the world that have brought peace to communities. It's time the police did likewise. It's time for a new social contract. It is time for change. So to each of you, I say thank you. And to be inspired also to share the words of Nelson Mandela when he said that no power on earth can stop an oppressed people determined to win their freedom. We have seen the young generation determined. We have seen the streets of America determined to seek change. Your combined brilliance today shows that the answers are there, the policies are there. So for goodness sake, in the United States of America, make Donald Trump history in November. And if the world could vote, you would win that election, hands down. Thank everybody.
Thank you, Philip. That was wonderful. Just to say that I don't want to wait till November. I'd like to see Trump gone soon, and I think this is in part what the struggle is about. I want to close just with a couple of quick remarks. One is that we will be sending out to everybody on this list a list of organizations that you can their organizational links, so you can follow up with them. A whole range of activities and resources that you can draw on. I think it's very clear that it's like a conference. We come together, and that's meaningful in and of itself. But what's most important is what we do in the days afterwards. I guess the last thing I wanted to say is I want to thank Karlene and Louis and Jim for sharing of their both their pain, but also their spirits of resistance. I also just want to acknowledge that most of the people on this call have been white, and the question is, they've offered up their pain, they've offered up their time and their thought and their hope, and I think ultimately the question is for us, how will we respond? What will we do? What kind of change? What kind of commitments will we make? And it's in every kind of level. As Philip was pointing out, it's at every level of our lives. As Karlene talked about, it's in dealing with the organizations that we're a part of and the communities that we're part of. So I want to thank you for joining us. We'll also send you the link to the recording so you can share it with others.
Joseph?
Yes.
We have a request from Emily Rubino that we give the speakers a last word if they would like to share something else.
That sounds good. We hadn't planned to go quite so long, but that would be great. Why don't we go in the same order that people spoke initially? Karlene? You're muted.
I will simply reiterate again that a new world is possible and that our movements are predicated upon following the leadership of young people and those who are mostly impacted, but also of linking arms across movements and across boundaries and across borders to affirm the dignity and human rights of all of us. Even of Emily's leadership, the group of young people within the peace movement, even at ICANN, in terms of speaking of movements led by young people within our midst. And so I'm grateful for this platform and all of you colleagues and comrades from Emmy in the anti-war movement in Japan, Shinfunjin, and other friends here. I just want to say thank you and look forward to continuing the struggle.
I want to share in the appreciation. I'm sorry. Okay. I certainly want to share in the appreciation of being invited and to share this space with so many people who I find kindred spirits. So thank you for that. I also want to lift up that with George Floyd's last breath, he called for his mama. That's important to me. Yeah. It's important because so much of what we're experiencing now is a result of masculinity and the notion that women are second. And maybe it's time to revisit who we put in positions of leadership. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. Jim?
Yes, I joined in this chorus of witnesses who know and now must do. I would only urge that you go forth, not only with the spirit, but with the action. To say Black Lives Matter, many people have a slogan, but if you ask them what's behind it, nothing. Let that not be your tag. If you say it, show it. Before you say it, learn about it. And never forget, we together do better. I'm telling you, this is our moment. We are in the whirlwind of an opportunity. And as I'll end by saying, as I started, it is an impregnated moment. The question is, what will we deliver?
Thank you, Jim. That's, I think, a good note for us to close on. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we'll be following up. This is hardly the end. Thank you so much.